my name is Denise Nadeau, and I'm a affiliate assistant professor in the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia University, which is in Jigjagi and in Ganya-Geha territory. And I'm currently actually residing in Lekwungen territory on Vancouver Island, so I'm speaking at a distance here. And I'm a settler, and my field of study is Indigenous settler relations, decolonizing of the body, and in particular, deconstructing whiteness and Christianity. And I just published a book called Unsettling Spirit, A Journey into Decolonization. And my main passion right now is looking at decolonization and decolonization of the body. This is a topic that I think is really important, which is what I call the politics of trauma in relationship to racism and colonialism. So we have a time where there has been so much exposure of the incredible inequities in our society because of COVID, because of Black Lives Matter, because of the pandemic. And so there's a tendency to get a lot of medicalized, pathologized language into how to deal with people who are suffering at this point. So I want to briefly speak about how some of the discourse about trauma reinforces racist and colonial structures. And I would want to talk a bit about white body supremacy and how that's playing into this. And also, I want to talk about what this means for the classroom right now, the virtual and real classroom. Trauma discourse has become very popular in our culture. A friend came over and said, oh, my friend's daughter's been traumatized because she's had 6 French immersion teachers in the last 5 months, and that's very traumatic. And I go, oh, yes, very traumatic. But I don't really think that's traumatic. I think this word is used for any kind of discomfort, often that white people suffer. But what does the word mean in the context of certain disciplines? And a lot of these disciplines are social work, often in religion, but more religion in terms of service, counseling, medicine, therapy, nursing. So the helping professions, this word is used a lot. And just a little aside that social work and counseling had origins in Christian mission, which the purpose of Christian mission was to civilize the uncivilized. So already there's a problematic dynamic in how these disciplines were set up. And the main thing was there were problem people in the world that we needed to fix and help incorporate them into the white capitalist world, which I think is a dynamic that still is very much part of these disciplines. So trauma itself is a term that refers to a group of symptoms that occur in the mind and body-mind, that happen when someone experiences an event of danger and they are unable to get out of the situation. They're unable to fight, they're unable to flee, and they're unable to fight, flight, or flee. Those are the usual kind of terminology. And so what happens is the response gets almost frozen in the body, or it's internalized in the body. And then what happens, as long as that experience isn't metabolized or processed, then there is trauma patterns develop in the person's behavior, because whenever something similar happens, even a tiny thing like somebody whose back is turned when you have been attacked from the back and you're back and they're behind you, then all the old symptoms reemerge with even more of an intensity, and you have flashbacks, hypertension, or another response, which is called hyporesponse, immediately go into flaccidity, don't feel, coldness, numbness. And so that's kind of just a brief overview of what trauma patterns are. And they have a psychological component. You can be, if you've had what's called a hyper response, which is when there's a hypertension response, there's often an anger within you. And if you've had a hypo response, which is the more of a collapse and not feeling in the muscles, then there is a giving up. So bodily symptoms vary, but how the individual was unable to process it is a key component of it. Now, at the same time, these responses were brilliant survival strategies in a situation of danger, and they were very useful. So no one is to be criticized for that response when they were a woman being raped, someone being attacked by the police. All these things are survival responses which are very useful. So there's two types of trauma: life and death trauma, which is usually accidents, earthquakes, more natural phenomena, falling off a ladder. And then there's relational trauma, trauma that happens because of an abuse of power, an abuse in the relationship. And my interest has been in relational trauma. So what has become more apparent as there's been more and more study into the field of trauma is that trauma can be passed on through generations, through culture. And so you have now the terms intergenerational trauma and the terms historical trauma. So what is so interesting is that the language about trauma and healing that has been dominant in the healing professions, in our government, in social services, in the media, is very much based on a medical model of illness, which pathologizes symptoms that people have. And I was doing my own work with Indigenous women in the downtown east side of Vancouver, luckily with an Anishinaabe colleague and a few colleagues who educated me about the work of medical anthropologists who challenged the discourse of trauma and specifically of the term post-traumatic stress disorder, which is often used interchangeably and describes these symptoms. And what I discovered from medical anthropology is a term called social suffering, which refers to collective suffering. And Arthur Kleinman and Robert Desjardins were two medical anthropologists who were looking at returning Vietnam War veterans who had all these same body symptoms, and realized that this was not a question of individual pathologies. It was a question of moral and unjust structures, and that certain populations who had experienced war, state terrorism, unjust political and economic structures had these responses in their body. And this was not a problem of medical pathology. It was a moral, ethical, and justice problem. So what happens is labels like PTSD and trauma can be used to individualize and deny race, class, gender, and colonial violence. And that has been one of the most important things that I have focused on in the last few years. There was a Jesuit psychologist who was killed during the war in El Salvador in 1989, who coined the term psychosocial trauma. And he was talking about how violence affects a whole network of social relations, and that you have to change the social relations between the colonizer and the colonized if you're going to have any change. And so there's not a lot of point on focusing just on individuals. So how is trauma politicized? Like that's the framework within which trauma discourse happens, but how has it become politicized? And Deanne Million, who's an Athabascan social worker, has a wonderful book called Therapeutic Nations, where she's saying that the focus on individual healing benefits neoliberalism. And she uses the term trauma economy. So the solution to for the trauma economy to endemic injustice, poverty, poor health, suicide risk is the healing of trauma. Her term, the colonial subject becomes a trauma victim, is really important because when you look at the whole dynamics around the politics of residential schools and dealing with indigenous reparations and the need for resurgence and sovereignty, what you have is a government response that is focused on healing more mental health resources rather than dealing with unjust structures and returning land. Trauma is used for other different political ends. There's a book called The Empire of Trauma by Didier Fassin and Robert Reichman, who discuss how the politics of reparations, testimony, and proof are now based on the degree of trauma a person has suffered rather than the unjust structures that they've endured. And so often you get financial settlements, but no reparation of the fundamental inequities in the situation. And again, I point to the settlement agreement with residential school survivors here in Canada, where individuals who had been at residential school and had been sexually or emotionally or physically abused were paid out money according to how many years they had been in residential school. This does not solve the problem of colonialism, the fact that residential school is part of a whole system to eradicate Indigenous connection to land. So again, the discourse of trauma is used to individualize a social problem. Indigenous scholar Larry Gross, who's an Anishinaabe, coined the term post-apocalyptic stress syndrome. And he talks about how Indigenous people experience with colonialism their end time, and with the loss of education structures, their health structures, their language, governance structures. Though luckily, there's always been resilience and survival within these communities. And so now these structures are being revitalized. But I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, Linda Smith, who's a Maori scholar, also critiquing apocalypse language because Indigenous people have experienced their own apocalypse. And you will find that Indigenous communities are almost the most prepared to deal with the pandemic here in Canada, and here in BC, for instance, where you have from the government and the media, oh, these poor communities, it's true, have often no water and our housing is impossible to social distance, but there's still, it's the same victim narrative. In terms of Black people, there's Dr. Joy DeGroot coined the term post-traumatic slave syndrome. So again, getting out of this individualizing of pain. And I remember being so disturbed when one of the descriptions of George Floyd's murder would say, oh, he had PTSD. And I went, oh my God, what? It just showed the same mentality of individualizing the economic and social and racial injustice that George Floyd had experienced. And I always want to say, after talking about trauma, is the resilience and complexity of responses, even now in the pandemic, that you find in Indigenous and Black communities, and how people are surviving and developing their own forms of healing and have always had their own forms of healing based in their cultures, despite the violence of racism and slavery. So how does white supremacy fit into this discourse on trauma? So our physical behavior, our non-verbal communication, our ways of moving through the world reproduce systems of power such as racism. And white body supremacy affects all bodies. For people who aren't white, it might be they might feel they need to whiten their skin or straighten hair or adopt certain white patterns of behavior to be accepted. It's very important to understand white supremacy, especially for white people, but also for all of us in terms of how it works within the culture. And I've been influenced by an African-American educator called Tema Kun, who talks about white supremacy culture, and she names the different aspects. She with the late Kenneth Jones, initiated a series of dismantling racism workshops in the United States. And I just want to read this list of characteristics of white supremacy culture, because they're also very embodied. And as I read them, and I myself do work on how I've embodied white supremacy culture. Either or thinking, perfectionism, which means a push, push, push in the body. Individualism, that's a whole world to unpack. A belief that there's only one right way, immediately tension in the body, one right way. Worship of the written word, what more can I say, as if the written word is the only right way of communicating. The right to conflict, the right to comfort, that I have a right to comfort. Fear of conflict, ooh, conflict, bad thing. Paternalism, ooh, write that word immediately. It brings out my great white helper, a term I created to look at how I was conditioned to feel that I had to help others. Defensiveness, sense of urgency. So these are some of the things that Okun has identified as part of white supremacy culture, which infiltrates the structures of organizations like universities, like Christian churches that are white. These all have embodied expressions, and they also come out in what's called microaggressions, what queer embodied somatic therapist calls 1,000 paper cuts a day you can get from just some of the hidden kind of unspoken aggressions that you can experience as racist behavior, sexist behavior. So my own work has been on the great white helper in myself and the different ways I've carried that in my body. But white supremacy is not rational. We're not going to be able to talk ourselves out of, think ourselves out of white supremacy. And I believe those whose interests lie in a white supremacy system are not going to give them up easily with just thinking, oh, this is bad. I mean, it's with any group that has their financial privileges and interests invested in power, they're not going to willingly give it up. Anyways, white supremacy is internalized deep in our bodies and has traumatic impacts on our bodies. So the person who, go back to myself, who was living this kind of helper disconnect from the own violence that I'd experienced in my life, and like many women, queer women, I've experienced a lot of violence in my life, totally disconnected. I had frozen part of myself so that I could help others. And so the white person constructs their identity on what other people, that they aren't what other people are. So it's already, as James Baldwin says, a totally false identity. Always read James Baldwin. He's who I recommend if you want to understand about whiteness. A famous African-American author. Now, just a few points about how we understand the body itself. The notion of the autonomous boundary body is a product of the 17th century scientific revolution. This is the biological body as a distinct object separate from the non-human and more than human world. And a Moroccan anthropologist, Frédéric Apfel-Margulies, looked at different understandings of the bodies with indigenous people in Orissa in India and in different indigenous nations in Peru, and found that within these groups, both saw the body as very fluid and open. There wasn't this sense of this boundary body, and hence interconnected with the plant and animal world, with the waters, with the land, and with the spirit worlds. So ritual and ceremony were integral to indigenous ways of living in the world, because you're involved in a reciprocal relationship with all these bodies that you're interconnected with. Now, what white body supremacy does, based on this boundary biological body, it reinforces the view of the autonomous individual disconnected body. And if bodies are disconnected, we don't have to worry about economic and social structures, because everything is up to the individual, right? So with the connected body, it's harder to separate the world of fact of values, which is very separated and is a premise of Western universities. And so when we're, I want to mention that because I just want to move on to talk about what this means for the classroom. And often there's not a lot of space for the spirit world and interconnection in university, and justice issues are about interconnection. So in terms of the classroom, what this means, first I want to talk about educators. I personally rarely use the word trauma. I often use collective suffering or social suffering, sometimes collective trauma. I talk about stressors and stress as they impact the body spirit. If a course content is specifically about trauma, I explain how traumatic reactions in the body function, and I now am providing some basic skills to help students stay in the present moment. And I'm doing another video just introducing some of basic body skills. And then I talk about the politics of trauma and how trauma can be misused, the discourse, and can often use to serve political agendas. So when an educator is discussing the physical and mental health challenges of specific communities, they can be placed within the larger context of colonial and racist violence, which needs to be addressed. Some of my Indigenous colleagues use the term genocide-informed practice as opposed to trauma-informed practice. And the main thing is to avoid victim framing. When, as an educator, I always focus more on resilience and collective healing approaches. And there's a danger with trauma language, especially historical intergenerational trauma language. This is important that people know about it, but it can also leave people feel like they're victims because they're caught in this body that's got all this historical trauma. And so it's more important to move stories away from risk and damage and to focus on resurgence and sovereignty, sovereignty over lands and bodies, body sovereignty, to be self-determined in the body as a framework rather than trauma and suffering. But trauma is real and the body is in the classroom. And so how do we deal with social suffering in the classroom or in the virtual classroom? How do we deal with disturbing material? This includes subject matter that might connect with racialized trauma in the room. So again, I frame the discussion of trauma, teach some skills. But I'll give an example. I've often have shown a film around the murdered and missing women, and if I can't have a local woman come in who speaks to this, a local Indigenous woman, what I do is I myself create a ceremonial container in the room. I acknowledge the spirits of these women are still with us. I acknowledge the ancestors. I spend a lot of time in silence, acknowledging the pain in the room. After the film, I'll allow for silence. I usually break up people according to Indigenous, people of color, white people. I really, I don't feel we should mix everybody up when there's so much pain in the room. And again, it's best to have someone come in who can speak to the topic, but if you can't, it's very important to create a ceremonial container and use silence. And give some people some idea of what's happening in their bodies. And lastly, I encourage each of us to do our own work. be it on white body supremacy or Indigenous, Black or Brown, work for Indigenous, Black or Brown people, become aware of the healing traditions in your own culture, and learn to become aware of when one braces and constructs when you're in a situation and you hold your breath, and get to know one's body in racially charged situations, and that will give us resources to deal with them better. Now, I have a few resources. I have 5 ones I want to share with you. One is Diane Million's book, Therapeutic Nations, which is an academic analysis, but brilliant, of how the trauma economy relates to Indigenous people. Resmaa Menakem is an African-American therapist. He has a book called My Grandmother's Hands, dealing with racialized trauma. I disagree with his one point that we're going to resolve all racism through body work, because, as I said, it's collective. There's structures that have to be dealt with, but he has some great activities for people really helping to work through the body pain and suffering, white body supremacy, and the pain for racialized bodies as well. And he's got a great bibliography. Ruth King, Mindfulness of Race, a Buddhist from the Insight meditation tradition. Very good work, inner work for people of all races. That isn't a therapy text where Menakem does do, can raise issues for you. She's much more chill with working with meditation. And then I'm recommending my own book, so a lot of which looks at white supremacy and the Great White Helper, but also has a lot of references I've made. And then an article, Anishinaabe, Cree, Alanin Young Leon, who I have written many on Indigenous pedagogies, one in an excellent book on embodiment and decolonization to help create a more embodied classroom. So thank you for listening. I hope this has been helpful.